October 14, 1943. Lipo Forest, occupied Poland. Somewhere in the darkness between the pines, 400 German soldiers were moving in a line 3 kilometers wide. They had maps, they had radios, they had dogs trained to track human scent through frozen mud. They had orders from Berlin itself to flush out the partisan fighters hiding in this forest and destroy them before dawn. They had everything, except they had no idea where they were. The trail they were following, the one their informant had personally guaranteed, curved south when it should have gone north, turned toward marshland where their maps showed solid ground, and seemed to multiply and split in every direction at once, as if the forest itself was fighting them. By morning, 3 companies were hopelessly separated. Their commander was standing in knee-deep water, and not a single partisan had been captured. What they did not know, what they would never fully understand, was that a 34-year-old schoolteacher had been one step ahead of them the entire time. Her name was Marta Nowak, and she had been planning this for 6 months. The village of Radlow sat at the edge of the Lipo forest like a stone dropped at the hem of a dark curtain. It had perhaps 200 souls at the start of the war: farmers, woodcutters, a miller, a priest, and a schoolteacher. By the autumn of 1943, the German occupation had reduced it to something smaller and more frightened. The young men were gone. The food was thinner. The road through town carried German trucks 3 times a week, and everyone had learned to look at their boots when the trucks went by. Marta Nowak had been teaching in Radlow for 9 years. She had grown up in the village herself, the daughter of a forester, and had spent her childhood following her father through the WWII, learning which trails flooded after rain, which clearings were visible from which ridgelines, where the deer paths twisted back on themselves and confused even experienced hunters. She had a memory for landscape the way some people have a memory for faces. She could walk the forest in darkness. She often had. She was not, to look at her, a remarkable woman. She was slight, with dark hair she kept pinned back, and a face that tended toward quiet seriousness. Her students found her warm but exacting. She graded harshly, corrected firmly, and had a habit of stopping mid-sentence when she sensed that a child was not truly listening. She believed deeply in precision, in knowing things completely, in the difference between understanding a subject and merely being familiar with it. These were not qualities that seemed dangerous. The Germans who occupied the nearby town of Jelka-Wola saw a village school teacher and thought nothing of it. When they needed lodging, she gave it without protest. When they asked questions, she answered carefully and correctly. She was cooperative, she was forgettable. This was entirely on purpose. What the Germans did not see was what happened in the schoolroom after the children went home. The maps Marta kept in the locked drawer of her desk, not the official German-issued maps, but hand-drawn ones, updated constantly, showing every trail, every sinkhole, every seasonal waterway in the Lipo forest and the fields surrounding it. What they did not see were the messages she passed, hidden inside the spines of books lent to certain farmers, or the evening she spent listening to a shortwave radio hidden beneath the floorboards of the back room. Marta had not set out to become a resistance operative. She had begun small, passing along information about German troop movements to a man named Carol, who she knew only as a contact and never by his partisan name. A truck she had seen, a conversation overheard at the well, small things, the kind of intelligence that, assembled with other small things, let the fighters in the forest stay alive. But as the months passed, Marta understood something that the men in the forest, brave as they were, sometimes did not. The most powerful weapon she had was not a gun or a radio. It was knowledge. Specifically, her knowledge of the land and the enemy's ignorance of it. She began to think bigger, not about what she could report, about what she could engineer. Her motive was not ideology in any pure sense. She had watched the Germans take 3 boys from the village in the spring, boys she had taught for forced labor in the West. She had watched an old man beaten in the road for failing to move aside quickly enough. She had watched her country disappear, quietly and methodically, piece by piece. Something in her, the same part that could not tolerate a student who only half understood a lesson, refused to accept this as the permanent condition of the world. She was going to do something about it. It would just take the right moment. Her first operation was modest by design. In the spring of 1943, a German supply convoy was scheduled to pass through the region on its way north. The partisans wanted to raid it, but the road was exposed and German patrols were frequent. Marta knew of a secondary track, Barely a track at all, more of a woodcutter's habit than a road, that branched off the main route 2 kilometers east of Radlow and rejoined it 3 kilometers further north. It was passable for trucks in dry weather, and the weather had been dry. She passed this information to Carol. The partisans used the track to approach the convoy from an unexpected angle. The raid succeeded, and the Germans spent the following week searching the wrong section of forest. Nobody in Radlow was questioned. That spring and summer, Marta developed what she thought of as her system. She kept her intelligence gathering visible and her analysis invisible. The observations she made: the German garrison strength in Wielke, the schedule of patrol rotations, the location of a new field telephone line strung along the northern road. These she committed to memory first, paper second, and passed to Carol only through intermediaries she trusted completely. She had 4 of these: Piot, a 17-year-old student who made regular trips to Wielke on his bicycle under the pretext of delivering bread for his mother's bakery; old Henrik, the miller, who was ancient enough that German soldiers rarely looked at him twice; Sister Agatha from the village church, who moved between households under the cover of pastoral visits; and a woman named Sophia who cleaned the floors of the German administrative office in Wielke, and had a remarkable talent for appearing not to listen. Through these 4 people, I'd assembled a picture of German intentions in the region that was, by late summer of 1943, surprisingly complete. She knew that the partisan group hiding in the Lippau numbered around 60 fighters, that the Germans knew roughly where they were, and that a major sweep operation was being planned. She knew the sweep would involve a significant force, not the local garrison, but a full battalion brought in from outside. She knew it was coming in autumn, when the leaves would be off the trees and the forest thinner. What she did not yet know was exactly when. In September, she had her first serious close call. A German Gendarmerie sergeant named Werner, a heavy-set man with a deliberate manner who had been stationed in Wielke for 6 months, came to the school one afternoon, ostensibly to check whether the curriculum included any prohibited materials. Marta met him at the door with her lesson plan open in her hands, going over long division problems she had marked that morning. He looked through her desk, found nothing, glanced at the bookshelf, found nothing there either, and left. He had been standing 18 centimeters above the floorboard under which her radio was hidden. That evening, Marta sat for a long time at her kitchen table without moving. She thought about what would have happened if Werner had looked down, or knocked on the wood by chance, or been accompanied by someone with a dog. She thought about this very carefully and systematically, the way she thought about everything, and then she decided that the radio needed to be moved. She moved it the following day, to a hollow in an oak tree, at the edge of the forest that she had known since childhood. She did not stop operating. She did not scale back her activities. She simply made them harder to find. By October, through Zophia's careful listening and Piotr's sharp eyes on the roads, Marta had learned what she needed. The battalion was arriving on the 12th. It was commanded by a major named Brecker. Its objective was to clear the Lippau of partisans before the first frost. It had 400 men, a company of German shepherd tracking dogs, and strict orders to take no prisoners. She had 2 days. She sent word to Carol: "Do not move. Stay exactly where you are. Trust me." Then she began to work. Major Ernst Brecker was not a man who underestimated operations. He had commanded similar sweeps in Belorussia and understood that forest terrain favored defenders. He had planned carefully. He had divided his battalion into 3 companies: Alpha to the north end of the forest, Bravo through the center, Charlie sweeping up from the south, with the intention of compressing any partisan group into a shrinking perimeter. He had field radios at each company headquarters. He had local maps drawn from aerial reconnaissance. He had a contact in the region, a man named De Beck, a known informant who had provided reliable intelligence in the past. What Brecker did not know was that Marta knew about De Beck. She had known for 3 months. She had not reported this to the partisans because she had been saving the knowledge for the right moment. Now was the right moment. 2 nights before the sweep was scheduled to begin, Marta walked to De Beck's farm at the edge of the village. She carried a lantern and a basket of preserved vegetables, a perfectly natural thing for a neighbor to bring in autumn. She sat at his table and talked with him for almost an hour. She talked about the hardships of the occupation, the cold coming, the price of things. She was warm and unhurried. And near the end of the conversation, as if it had simply occurred to her, she mentioned that she had seen lights in the forest the previous night, east of the big meadow, the one the locals called Sarna. She described the lights in convincing detail. She said she assumed it was probably deer hunters or maybe someone gathering late mushrooms, but it had seemed strange. She said it casually, then changed the subject. She walked home through the cold dark and went to bed. The next morning, she rose before dawn and went into the forest. She had asked Piotr to meet her there at first light, and he was waiting at the agreed spot, stamping his feet against the chill. She gave him a task. Between now and tomorrow evening, using other boys she trusted, she needed a series of shallow marker holes dug at specific intervals along 4 trails in the eastern part of the forest. Trails she identified precisely from memory, marking each one on a hand-drawn sketch she pressed into his hands. The markers were to be dug at the right side of each trail, at knee-height, covered with bark. He asked no questions. He nodded and left. Marta then spent most of that day doing something that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. She walked. She walked the forest trails she had known since childhood, the ones that cut north from the big meadow, and she studied them with a forester's granddaughter's eye. She was looking for specific things, where the trail surface changed from firm soil to the soft, dark ground that indicated subsurface water, where the narrower side paths branched off in directions that seemed logical from one angle, but led half a kilometer on into thick deadfall or boggy ground, where the trail markers placed by woodcutters years ago had rotted or fallen, leaving routes that were clear at the start and impassable at the end. She found 4 such places. She memorized their precise locations relative to identifiable trees. Then she walked home for supper. That evening, Marta created her master map. Not the kind she would keep, this one was designed to be found. It was drawn on a single sheet of paper, in pencil, with a steady and convincing hand. It showed the Lippo forest in accurate detail, with trails, clearings, and the approximate positions of the German garrison to the north correctly marked. And then, in the center of the map, circled twice in a way that suggested urgency, was a location, a clearing with a stream running through it, tucked into a bend in the forest, labeled in careful Polish, base camp, ammunition stores, 40 to 60 men. The location was real. It was a clearing Marta had known for 20 years. It was also, from October through the spring thaw, surrounded on 3 sides by a marsh that was invisible until you were standing in it. She folded the map, placed it in the cloth bag with a handful of partisan-style items, a tin cup, a worn compass, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, and handed the bag to Henrek the miller with brief instructions. He understood without being told entirely, as old Henrek usually did. The next morning, on the road outside the village, a German patrol found a cloth bag left hanging from a fence post. Inside were what appeared to be abandoned partisan supplies and a map. The patrol brought the bag directly to Major Brecker. When the sweep began on the evening of October 14th, Brecker had adjusted his plan. The original grid formation was modified to concentrate effort on the eastern quadrant of the forest, specifically toward the clearing marked on the found map. He was not naive enough to trust a single piece of intelligence, but he trusted it enough to steer toward it. His Alpha Company pushed south through the north end of the forest, while Bravo drove east, with Charlie holding the southern line. What happened next unfolded over approximately 9 hours. Alpha Company entered the eastern section of the forest in the dark and found themselves on a trail that the soldiers of the front reported as firm and clear. It was clear for perhaps 800 meters. Then, where the trail bent slightly left around a stand of birch, the ground changed. The soldiers at the front stepped onto ground that looked solid but was not, a wide shelf of matted vegetation floating over black water. The first 3 men went into their knees. The company halted. In the noise and confusion of reorganization, the radio operator moved to find better ground and stepped into a deeper section. He went into his waist. By the time Alpha's commander had assessed the situation, turned the column around, and found a secondary route, 40 minutes had been lost and 3 men needed dry clothes. The secondary route they chose was one of Marta's trails with a marker hole. Pietor's small team had been through there that afternoon. At each marked point, they had done something simple, moved or obscured the natural trail indicators that experienced woodsmen left unconsciously. A broken branch turned the wrong way, a cairnstone displaced, a fallen log rolled to block what looked like the continuation of the path, redirecting anyone following the trail onto a branching path that curved steadily back south. Alpha Company walked for an hour and arrived, essentially, where it had started. Bravo Company had its own difficulty, moving through the center of the forest. It was guided partly by its aerial maps and partly by Debec's intelligence, which had placed partisan activity in the eastern meadow, the Sarna meadow, which was exactly where Marta had told him she had seen lights. Bravo reached the meadow after 90 minutes of movement and found it empty. While the company commander conferred with Brecker by radio, 3 of his scouts pushed into the tree line on the far side and heard something. Movement, voices, the sound of equipment. They reported back with urgency. The company moved toward the sounds. What they were following was the wind in the birches and the sound of a stream below a limestone shelf. The forest in that section produced sounds at night that, to ears already primed with expectation, sounded remarkably like men moving. Marta had known this her entire life. Her father had taken her to hear it when she was 7 years old, laughing at her startled expression. She had thought of it often, walking back to her house the previous morning. Charlie Company, coming from the south, encountered the tracking dogs acting strangely almost immediately. The dogs were pulling in multiple directions, sitting down, doubling back. The handlers were frustrated and confused. This was partly the result of Marta's last piece of preparation, something simple enough that she had almost not bothered with it and then had. The previous afternoon, she had asked Zofia to bring her several pairs of old German army bootliners from the rag collection at the administrative office. Zofia had managed 2 pairs. Marta had walked specific trails in the southern forest wearing the bootliners laced to the bottom of her own boots, creating a confusing overlay of scents, human, German leather, forest, that the dogs found genuinely disorienting. They were not following nothing. They were following everything at once, which in practice was worse. By 3 in the morning, Brecker's companies were separated, disoriented, and operating on fragmentary radio contact. Alpha was effectively going in circles. Bravo had pushed half a kilometer into dense forest, pursuing sounds that did not correspond to any human presence. Charlie was stationary, waiting for the dogs to settle, which they would not. 63 partisans, lying absolutely still in their actual camp, 2 kilometers northwest of the false map location, in a section of forest that Marta had specifically told Carol to hold, heard the German companies calling to each other across the dark. They heard the whistles and the shouted commands growing gradually more distant, then confused, then silent. At 4:15 in the morning, Carol gave the order to move. The partisans walked east through the forest in a column away from the German companies, using a trail that Marta had provided in her last message to Carol, a route she had verified herself on foot, tested for firm ground, and marked at intervals with small white stones placed at the base of specific trees. They moved without lights. They moved without speaking. They crossed the forest road at its narrowest point and vanished into the hills beyond before dawn. None of them were captured. None of them were even seen. Brecker's after-action report, later recovered from German military archives after the war, attributed the failure of the Lippo sweep to adverse terrain conditions and unreliable local intelligence. He noted that his companies had covered significant ground, but made no contact with the enemy. He did not write because he did not know that his formations had been systematically misdirected by a series of environmental manipulations he had no framework to recognize. He recommended that future sweep operations in the region be preceded by a more thorough topographical survey. He was transferred to a different sector the following month. Sergeant Werner, the Feldgendarmerie man who had stood over Marta's hidden radio, filed a separate report noting that the village of Radlow should be considered a possible source of partisan support and recommending increased surveillance. The recommendation sat in a filing cabinet in Wilka Walla and was never acted on because by the following spring, the German military situation had deteriorated to a degree that made a small Polish forest village a low priority for anyone's attention. Debec, the informant, continued to believe that the failed sweep had been the result of bad luck. He had passed along what he had been told. He could not explain why the lights in the eastern meadow had led to nothing, because he did not know there had never been any lights. In Radlow itself, the aftermath was quiet in the way that things are quiet when people are very carefully not saying anything aloud. Henrik the Miller found reasons to stop by the school several times that week. Sister Agata held an extra evening prayer service that was more crowded than usual. Piotr came to school with dirt under his fingernails that he had not entirely scrubbed out. Nothing was said. The Germans who passed through the village in the days after the sweep were brisk and uncommunicative. Nobody was arrested. Marta taught her classes. She taught long division to the younger children, geography to the older ones. She corrected compositions about autumn and the harvest and, in one case, a surprisingly thoughtful essay about rivers and where they went when they reached the sea. She graded carefully. She wrote comments in the margins in her small, precise handwriting. She walked home in the evenings along the same road, passed the same houses, and cooked supper and went to bed. But the toll of what she had done was not nothing. She understood this. The concentration required to hold the plan in her mind. Every element, every contingency, every person had used something that did not simply refill. In the weeks after the sweep, she found herself waking at 3 in the morning with her heart striking hard against her ribs, running through scenarios. What if Brecker had sent a platoon north rather than east? What if the dogs had not been confused? What if one of the boys helping Piotr had talked? She was not a soldier. She had no training for this. She had only the habit of preparation and a childhood spent learning a forest that she loved. And love, she understood now, was a fragile and demanding instrument. It gave you knowledge, but it also made you afraid of what you might lose. She thought often about the partisans she had never met. 63 people whose names she did not know, whose faces she had never seen, who had walked out of the forest alive because she had sat at a table with a neighbor and mentioned a detail about lights. The distance between what she had done and what might have happened was so small and so large that it did not bear looking at directly. She thought about the boys taken for labor in the spring. She thought about the old man in the road. She thought about her father walking her through the forest when she was small, showing her which plants grew near water and which hills gave the best view at sunrise, explaining that a person who knew a place well was never truly lost in it. She held on to that. The war in Poland did not end cleanly. The liberation, when it came in 1944 and 1945, brought its own complications, and the years that followed were shaped by political circumstances that made certain stories difficult to tell. Marta Nowak's story was among them. She had worked with a partisan group whose post-war political associations were complicated under the new government, and the kind of careful individual civilian resistance she had practiced did not fit neatly into the official histories being written. She remained in Radlow. She taught school until 1971, when she retired at 62, and she lived in the same house until her death in 1984. She gave one interview in her lifetime to a local historical researcher in 1978, in which she spoke at length about pedagogy and very briefly about the war, and then only in general terms. She described herself as having kept notes and helped where she could. The researcher, not knowing what to look for, did not push further. Piotr, who had grown up and become a forester, which surprised nobody who had known him as a boy, gave a longer account in the 1990s, after the political circumstances changed. It was Piotr's testimony, cross-referenced with the German military archives that had by then been made available to researchers, that allowed historians to reconstruct what had actually happened in the Lippo forest in October of 1943. The after-action reports that described adverse terrain conditions and unreliable local intelligence were read again with new understanding. The complaints about dogs behaving strangely, the reports of Alpha Company's hour-long circle, Bravo's phantom pursuit, the testimony of a partisan survivor who described lying absolutely still in the forest and listening to German whistles growing distant. It all assembled, piece by piece, into a picture that matched Piotr's account with remarkable precision. Old Henrik and Zofia and Sister Agata had all died before the full story was known. Carol, whose real name turned out to be Stanislaw Drozd, had survived the war and become a carpenter. He confirmed what Piotr said and added that he had always known the plan had come from someone in the village, but that he had only learned it was Marta years later. He said he had not been entirely surprised. He said she had always sent information that was precise, and that precision in the forest was worth more than weapons. A small memorial was placed at the edge of the Leipzig in 2006. It does not carry Marta Nowak's name alone. It carries the names of all the civilians in the region who assisted the resistance, most of them people who had taught, or farmed, or baked bread, or swept floors, and had done something extraordinary between ordinary things. But those who researched the events most carefully kept returning to one detail. Major Brecker's 3-company battalion, disoriented and wandering through the dark while 63 people walked to safety, guided by stones at the base of specific trees, placed there by a woman who had learned, at her father's side in the same forest 30 years before, that the difference between knowing a place and merely passing through it was the difference between being lost and being free. She had taught that lesson to her students for decades. In October of 1943, she taught it to an entire German battalion. They never knew they were in her classroom.